At exactly 0800 hours on the morning of August 7, 1942, Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson crouched waist-deep in the coral shallows off Tulagi Island, his boots grinding against sharp limestone fragments as he watched the first wave of Marine Raiders push forward toward the beach. The lagoon stretched out before them in an eerie stillness that felt unnatural, as though the island itself were holding its breath. The shoreline had been silent for 6 full minutes, a stretch of time long enough to make even veteran Marines uneasy. Overhead, the rising sun burned through drifting columns of black smoke left behind by carrier aircraft that had struck moments earlier, turning 15 Japanese seaplanes in Tulagi harbor into flaming wrecks. The only sound now was the rhythmic splash of 800 Marines wading through chest-deep water, rifles held high, boots churning coral into white powder beneath the surface. Edson was 45 years old, lean, weathered, and hardened by years of fighting in places most Americans had never heard of. Nicaragua, Haiti, China. He had personally trained the 1st Marine Raider Battalion to operate in darkness, to move silently through jungle and broken terrain, and to fight when confusion and fear overwhelmed lesser units. But what waited for them on Tulagi was unlike anything they had faced before. Somewhere beneath the limestone ridges ahead, Japanese defenders had already sent a message to Rabaul that would echo through the next 48 hours of violence. Enemy troop strength is overwhelming. We will defend to the last man. Commander Masaki Suzuki had spent 3 relentless months turning Tulagi into a fortress disguised as an island. Beneath its jungle canopy lay a labyrinth of limestone caves, tunnels, and firing positions carved directly into the rock. Each bunker had been designed to survive naval bombardment. Each approach route had been carefully shaped into a killing zone, covered by overlapping machine gun fire and knee mortars capable of dropping explosive shells with chilling accuracy. Suzuki's 3rd Kure Special Naval Landing Force were not ordinary garrison troops. They were elite naval infantry, trained in night infiltration, bayonet combat, and the doctrine that surrender was worse than death. They had never abandoned a position, and they did not intend to start now. When the cruiser San Juan's 6-inch guns had pounded Hill 281 that morning with nearly 300 rounds, Suzuki's men did not panic. They withdrew deeper into their limestone shelters and waited. They understood the rhythm of American warfare, and they knew the true battle would begin after sunset. By midday, Edson's Raiders had linked up with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, and were advancing toward the southeastern spine of the island. But when they reached the real defensive core, a ravine packed with caves, sandbagged firing ports, and concealed tunnel entrances, Edson checked his watch and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. There was not enough daylight left. Not enough time to break positions that could absorb direct hits from naval guns and remain intact. The Japanese had prepared for this moment with methodical precision. As the Marines dug in along a hastily established wire perimeter near the cricket ground, Edson understood the enemy's intent. The Japanese were choosing the night. And night was when the Special Naval Landing Forces were at their deadliest. But the Raiders had been trained for something Suzuki had never faced before, a unit that could fight in darkness without panic, that could coordinate fire like a conductor leading an orchestra, and that could turn chaos into calculated destruction. What followed over the next 48 hours would prove that when elite troops collide, courage alone does not decide the outcome. Victory belongs to the side that brings the right tools, in the right order, at the right moment. The first Marine to step onto Tulagi's coral beach was a 19-year-old private from Kansas named Jimmy Morrison, a farm boy who had never been under fire. He splashed ashore at 0803, gripping his Springfield rifle with white knuckles, expecting machine gun fire that never came. Behind him, hundreds of Marines waited in water that should have been churned into foam by bullets. Instead, there was only silence, broken by boots crunching coral and the distant crackle of burning wreckage in the harbor. Edson landed moments later, scanning the tree line where Japanese defenses should have been roaring. The bombardment had worked better than expected, but Edson had learned long ago the difference between a defeated enemy and one that was simply waiting. He ordered the advance. The initial resistance was scattered and deceptive. A sniper's round cracked past Edson's head at 0830, fired from a palm tree that vanished in a burst of mortar fire moments later. A pair of machine gun bunkers opened up briefly, cutting down vegetation before satchel charges silenced them for good. By 0900, the Raiders were moving again, pressing southeast toward what intelligence maps labeled the heart of Japanese resistance. Captain Lewis Chesty Walt's Company A took point, advancing cautiously through terrain that looked open but felt wrong. Ahead lay the cricket ground, a wide clearing carved out years earlier by British colonial administrators. It stretched invitingly toward the limestone ridge beyond. Walt stopped his men and sent forward his best scout, a Cherokee Marine from Oklahoma named Tommy Crow Feather. Crow Feather moved through the jungle as if he belonged to it, returning 20 minutes later with news that changed everything. Hill 281 was not merely defended, it was hollowed out. Caves, tunnels interlocking fire. A fortress built into the earth itself. Edson studied the ground and made his decision. They would not attack tonight. They would dig in and let the Japanese come to them. Night fell hard over Tulagi, swallowing the island in suffocating darkness. At 22:30, the first knee mortar rounds whistled in, exploding among the Raider positions with an irregular rhythm that made them impossible to predict. Type 99 machine guns opened fire from hidden cave mouths, muzzle flashes blinking like fireflies across the ridge. Private First Class Edward Arentz, a 22-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin, crouched in his foxhole on the right flank, guarding a gap in the wire where a fallen tree offered a natural approach route. He listened to Japanese voices in the darkness, calm, disciplined, professional. Not screaming charges, but coordinated movement. The attack came from 3 directions at once. Infiltrators slipped through the ravine. A frontal assault charged across the cricket ground, bayonets gleaming. A third force worked the jungle on the left flank. Arentz opened fire at 15 yards, killing one attacker outright, wounding another, fighting at distances so close he could see faces in muzzle flashes. Grenades exploded. Coral fragments shredded the air. Men screamed and died in the dark. Wave after wave came. The Japanese probed, learned, adjusted. At one point they captured a Browning automatic rifle and turned it against its owners before a counterattack reclaimed it at terrible cost. Near Edson's command post, infiltrators nearly broke through before being driven back at bayonet point. By dawn, Arentz was still alive, but barely. 13 enemy dead lay around his foxhole. He had been wounded by shrapnel and stabbed in the shoulder, but he held the line. When the final assault came at 0400, launched with the desperation of men who knew daylight would doom them, Arentz fought until his rifle was empty. Captain Walt found him after sunrise, upright against the foxhole wall, a Japanese officer's sword buried in his chest, the officer dead at his feet. The wire had not been breached. As dawn broke on August 8th, the battlefield changed completely. Mortars began their work. Carefully aimed shells dropped directly into cave mouths, collapsing positions that had held all night. Demolition teams moved forward under covering fire, sealing entrances with TNT. Flamethrowers forced defenders from positions no explosive could reach. By afternoon, Hill 281 was silent. Commander Suzuki was dead. His men were gone. Tulagi was secured. And as the smoke drifted away and the Marines counted their dead, Colonel Edson understood something that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Fortresses could be built from stone and steel. But they fell to patience, coordination, and men trained to fight when the world went dark. While the Marines were still clearing the last shattered caves on Tulagi, Another battle had already ignited just across the narrow stretch of water to the east. At midday on August 7th, landing craft carrying Major Robert Williams and the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion scraped against the coral reef surrounding Gavutu Island, their hulls grinding to a halt nearly 500 meters short of the shattered seaplane ramp that had been the target of the morning bombardment. Smoke hung low over the island, thick with the smell of burning fuel and scorched metal. From a distance, it looked as though nothing alive could have survived the pounding it had taken. Up close, Williams could already hear machine gun fire. Williams was 34 years old, a former enlisted Marine who had earned his commission through grit rather than connections. He believed in simple plans because complicated ones fell apart the moment bullets started flying. His mission was brutally straightforward. Take Gavutu and its sister island Tanambogo. Destroy the Japanese seaplane base. Secure the anchorage that dominated the eastern approaches to Tulagi. But as the landing craft grounded early and his men were forced to wade ashore through knee-deep water, it became immediately clear that intelligence estimates had been dangerously optimistic. Japanese machine guns were still active, firing from positions that should have been obliterated. The coral reef left the paratroopers exposed, with no cover except scattered coral heads and the twisted wreckage of destroyed aircraft. Bullets snapped through the water, kicking up white splashes as men stumbled forward under fire. Gavutu rose steeply ahead of them, a limestone mass honeycombed with caves and reinforced positions that had absorbed naval shells like rain on stone. Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki had commanded the Yokohama Air Group's seaplane base for months, and he had used every available moment to prepare for this exact moment. His men were aviation personnel, not elite infantry, but they were disciplined naval servicemen who followed orders and understood that surrender was not an option. Hangars had been converted into bunkers. Maintenance sheds became strongpoints. Telephone lines ran deep underground, connecting positions immune to bombardment. The first Marines to reach the beach were pinned down almost immediately by heavy machine guns firing from concrete hangars that were cracked but intact. Lieutenant Paul Moore led his platoon forward through the shallow water, losing 2 men before they reached anything resembling cover. Williams set up his command post in a shell crater barely 50 yards from the beach, close enough to direct the fight but exposed to constant fire. Radio contact with naval gunfire support was unreliable, blocked by terrain and atmospheric interference. Within the first hour, casualties climbed past 10%. The key terrain was Hill 148, the highest point on Gavutu, and Williams knew nothing else mattered until it was taken. But every approach was covered by interlocking fire, and frontal assaults were bleeding his battalion dry. The situation changed when Sergeant Frank Guyden found something the Japanese engineers had overlooked, a drainage tunnel running from the beach directly into the base of the hill. It was narrow, partially flooded, and barely passable, but it offered concealment where none existed above ground. Guyden led a 6-man team through the tunnel with grenades and demolitions, emerging behind Japanese positions that had dominated the beach for hours. Their sudden appearance shattered the defenders' sense of control. Machine gun crews turned too late. Marines attacked from directions that should have been impossible. Williams seized the moment, pushing his reserves forward in a coordinated assault that cracked the defensive line and carried American troops onto the lower slopes of Hill 148. Still, the fight dragged on into the night. Japanese infiltrators moved between Gavutu and Tanambogo under cover of darkness, swimming or using small boats to evade Marine fire. Knee mortars dropped shells into American positions with terrifying accuracy. Snipers fired from unseen caves. By evening, Williams held roughly half the island, but his casualties were heavy and resistance remained stubbornly intact. Reinforcements arrived at dawn on August 8th. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hunt's 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines landed alongside 2 M3 Stuart light tanks. 13 tons of steel, armed with 37mm guns, The tanks immediately changed the battle. They could punch holes in concrete, blast cave mouths open, and provide mobile firepower that infantry simply could not match. Just as important was their psychological effect. Japanese defenders had never faced armored vehicles and had no proper anti-tank weapons. The assault on Tanambogo began that afternoon, one Stuart leading rifle squads across the exposed causeway under covering naval fire. The advance was swift, but the Japanese response was ferocious. Captain Miyazaki personally led a counterattack, directing aviation personnel armed with grenades and satchel charges against the tank's vulnerable points. The lead Stuart was immobilized and destroyed in brutal close-quarters fighting. When Marines retook the position hours later, they counted 42 Japanese bodies surrounding the wreck. The tank crew had fought until their ammunition ran out. By August 9th, resistance on both islands was collapsing. Systematic cave clearing, demolition charges, flamethrowers, and tank fire reduced the remaining strongpoints one by one. Captain Miyazaki died in his command bunker, detonating explosives rather than surrender. Japanese losses exceeded 470 killed, with only a handful of prisoners taken, mostly Korean laborers who had surrendered once their supervisors were dead. American casualties were heavy but decisive. 70 killed. 112 wounded. Back on Tulagi, the battlefield had grown quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Colonel Edson walked among collapsed cave entrances and shell craters as Marines searched for stragglers. The final count was staggering. Over 300 Japanese dead on Tulagi alone. Only 3 prisoners. 45 Marines killed. 76 wounded. Every loss represented months of training that could not be easily replaced. Captain Lewis Walt stood near the crater that had once been Edward Arence's foxhole, staring at the semicircle of bodies marking where the young Marine had made his stand. The wire gap remained unbreached. The defense had held because individual men had refused to yield ground even when the world collapsed around them. The tactical lessons were already being written into after-action reports. Naval gunfire alone could not destroy prepared positions. Mortars, demolitions, flamethrowers, and coordinated small unit leadership were essential. Cave warfare required patience, precision, and relentless pressure. Courage mattered, but training and methodical execution mattered more. Strategically, the victory secured the Southern Solomons. Japanese seaplane operations were eliminated. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal was protected from interference. More importantly, the psychological balance shifted. Elite Japanese units had fought exactly as their doctrine demanded, defending to the last man. And they had been annihilated. The message Suzuki sent to Rabaul had proven true in ways he never intended. His men had defended to the last. But the battle had shown that no fortress, no matter how carefully built, could withstand methodical assault by forces trained for the task. When the fighting finally ended, the silence over Tulagi was absolute. The silence of total victory earned not by luck or overwhelming numbers, but by preparation, discipline, and the hard lessons learned in 48 hours of blood and stone. When elite troops collided in the limestone caves of the Solomon Islands, the outcome was not decided by who fought harder, but by who understood the battlefield better. And in August of 1942, that understanding belonged to the United States Marines.